same church. And we're still active in that church.
3, 2, 1, whenever you're ready.
We're sitting here with Senator J. Verne Smith, a pillar of our community. His family's been a strong positive influence to the Greer area, and he's humbled us enough to come down here today and talk with us about his family and his roots here in Greer. And we're going to begin with that today, sir. Can you begin by telling us, how did the Smith family come to Greer?
Well, my great-great-grandfather came down. He came to this country through the port of Baltimore, Maryland. His daddy was an Englishman, and he came down through Culpeper, Virginia, and came on down and settled over here in Spartanburg County on the Tiger River. And his wife, Miss McElrath, came through the port of Charleston from County Down, Ireland. And the McElrath family, some of those still around here too. Susan Birch's father was a McElrath, and old Ronnie Bruce's mother was a McElrath. I don't always claim them, but I do whenever they're nice and all, and smile. But they're both Presbyterians too.
Sure.
And Ronnie's my Sunday school class. He's the mouth of the South. So
Right.
They came from over around Duncan. They had 9 children, and all grew up to be family people and had families. And from that couple, 34 served the Confederacy. 34, 11 lost their lives in the service of the Confederacy, either from wounds or disease.
Okay.
But they came to Greer and settled over around in the Pleasant Grove area, and that's where they founded Mount Tabor Church. Dr. Buse from Charleston came up here and helped them found that. We have the sessional records when that took place in 1841. In 1848, they dismissed 8 members to found the Washington Street Presbyterian Church in Greenville, which is now the biggest Presbyterian church in the state. Dr. Randy Kowalski is the minister over there, you know. We're their mother church. I like to tell them that to keep them humble, you know. And but they came to Greer because they were all farmers, and they with 9 children, and then they had to get more land and more land and more land, and so that's how they came to Greer to settle. And of course, my grandfather was born here, right out here at Pleasant Grove. His father was Samuel Smith, and he was a Confederate soldier, and he came back from the war. He was captured up at Bermuda 100 and imprisoned, but he came home, and my daddy was born in 1875. That's a long time ago. I was born in 1925. He was 50 years old. About as far back as I can remember is, of course, my daddy was a peach grower. He was a pioneer peach grower. He had the first commercial peach orchard operation in the upper part of the state, and he owned one in Alto, Georgia, too. So everything we wanted to buy, anything, we said, well, wait till after peach season. We'll see how we do with our peach crop.
Right.
But Daddy was a school trustee, and we didn't have consolidated schools then. We had what was called 9H school district, and I believe Greer High was the only high school in it at the time. And, when the banks closed in 1929 or 30, there wasn't any money to pay the school teachers. So my daddy fixed to put in another bathroom upstairs and put in some cedar-lined closets and 3 bedrooms, and we took in 6 school teachers, put warm morning heaters in each room. I had to clean the ashes out and lay the fire for the teachers to light in the morning so they could take their bath and be warm. And we kept 6 school teachers. Mama gave them 3 meals a day and a place to sleep, and waited till they were able to pay for it so we could help keep schools open. We've come a long ways. We still always talk about something wrong with our education, and we're not doing enough education. And of course, that is one of the most important things in our lives is education.
Yes.
I never will forget my daddy used to tell a story. The school trustees were elected, and one time there was a man that ran for the school board that was illiterate, but he was a very popular fellow. This was back in around the early 30s, maybe 29 or 30. And so this fella, it was in the real Depression time. You couldn't find a job anywhere. People were riding the railroad, hobos hunting job or something to eat. So this fella, to get a job teaching school, you had to go before the school trustees. So this fella says, gentlemen, I hear there's an opening to teach school here in Greer, to teach geography. So the fellow that I mentioned before says, well, Mr. So-and-so, do you teach the world is square or round? He says, well, I'm prepared to teach it either way if you'll give me this job.
There you go.
Now, that sounds impossible to be true, but it's a true story. So I remember in all the mill homes, there was no running water. They had outhouses. And I can remember when running water and sewer was put in the mill villages. Before that, they had outhouses, and they had a colored man that had 2 big horses and a big wagon with a tank-like thing, and he hauled off right by our house. We called it the sugar wagon, but he cleaned out the toilets. Now, that's not too pleasant to think about, but that's part of the history of Greer. That time we had 3 blacksmith shops downtown here. Blacksmith shop over there where McCleskey drugstore is. That was Mr. Edwards. And right down in this alley behind these stores was Mr. Basil's blacksmith shop. We had another one, I've forgotten his name, but getting your mules shod and your horses shod, and they did a lot of work on straightening axles for wagons and things like that. But on Saturday, farmers came into town, and they didn't come in cars because very few people had cars. They came with a horse and wagon, a buggy, a mule. Right across from the tire exchange, that whole lot was an open property and had hitching posts, and they'd hitch their horses and mules there, and it was covered with mules and wagons and horses, and people come in on Saturday to do the trading. Sometimes they bring cotton to the cotton gin to be gin. And there's one little funny story I was thinking about. Mr. Boyce Howard's daddy told me he and his daddy brought cotton in to get it ginned, and they carried the check to the bank. I won't call the name, but they got the check cashed, and they got out on the sidewalk. It was in the bank right up the street from here, where the VA Bennett Insurance is now. So they found they had $10 too much. So I went in the bank and told the man, said, "You all made a mistake when you cashed my check a while ago." Said, "We don't correct mistakes after you leave here." I said, "Well, all right." So he went on back about 4 miles up in the country. And late that night, the fellow in the bank came up there and said, "We checked up $10 short. Did we give you $2, $10 too much money?" I said, "Well, you said you didn't correct mistakes after the customer had left." And said he made him follow him about 2 rows with the plow, and then he gave him his $10 back. I thought that was a pretty good story. But, you know, I could just go on and on. But the schools were, and the churches were the center of all of our living, just about. And we had the main churches here was a Presbyterian church, the Methodist church, and the Baptist church, and each one had summer vacation Bible schools, and we usually went to all three of them, you know, because that was great fun for us.
Can I ask you another question?
Sure.
Okay. You talked a little bit. I'd like to spend a little time, if you would, talking about your father and his experiences. As far as your father started Peaches. Can you tell me why he started Peaches? But I know he was also involved in some other things. He was also. Can you talk a little bit about your father?
Well, my daddy was born right out here at Pleasant Grove. He had two brothers and a sister. And so his first job when he came to town was working assistant cashier for the Bank of Greer. Mr. Parker was president of the bank, and I call him Uncle Ted Bailey. Mr. E.C. Bailey was cashier, and my daddy was assistant cashier. I have an old calendar hanging in the tire exchange up there. It's got a pretty girl's picture on it, and it says a Southern Belle, and it's an advertisement for the Bank of Greer, I believe in 1905, just about 100 years ago. And but he started working there, and then he was always interested in growing things. He was reared on the farm and all, so he bought interest in the Greer Furniture Store, and he and Mr. Doug McCorkle and Mr. Wren Stone ran the Greer Furniture Store, and that's where my mama met him. Dr. Pete Hollis brought Mama here to teach school, and she lived in the teachers at Victor Mill, and they furnished her a horse and buggy, and she taught home economics and home demonstration to the girls and the mothers on all three mill hills, Greer Mill, Victor Mill, and Appalachian Mill. And so she came up there to buy some pots and pans and met my dad, and he was smitten with her. And he told us, I knew right then I was going to marry that girl. And so anyway, they did marry later. But he got interested in growing peaches, and he bought land, and his first cousin married Dr. Shaletta from Clemson College. He was the head of the horticulture department. And they were great friends, and they worked out together the peach orchard, how to set it out and how to tend to the trees and what chemicals to spray with and so forth. And so Daddy shipped more peaches in, I believe it was 1917, than the whole county of Spartanburg County, which later became the highest producing county, even produced more than the whole state of Georgia. But he was a president of the South Carolina Peach Growers Association when he died. He, as I said, he died in 1933. I was born in 1925, but when he died, my mother had to take over and run the farms and attend to the business, and she had just been a wife and a mother and so forth, but she was really a smart woman and a hard-working woman, determined woman. And I know she told me when Daddy died, she just felt the Lord put his hand in the pit of her back and said, as long as you trust in me, I will help you and your children do what you need to do. And we all worked together. She is a great woman, and she worked harder than any of us, but if she said, I think the garden needs hoeing. That means get up right now and go hoe the garden, not when you get through reading a funny paper or not when you get through listening to Amos Nanny on the phone. That means do your work now and then rest. I remember one thing. She said, people talk about turning it all over the Lord. She told us so many times that the Lord likes to help those who help themselves. I thought that had to be in the Bible, but I never could find it in the Bible. But it was, Mama told us, said the Lord won't hoe your cotton for you while you're on the creek bank fishing. And she meant you got to do your part for the Lord to be able to help you. And so that's been a great philosophy that she taught me. She taught me to be dependable. If you tell somebody something, you do it. If you tell somebody you're going to be someplace at a certain time, you be there. And dependability is one of the greatest character traits of anybody I know of, and my mother instilled that in me. I was blessed she lived till. You're going to cut off a little bit?
I'm afraid we're going to be able to hear them talking.
All right, sweetheart.
Sorry,
Thank you.
Just whatever you think best.
You need to get a drink of water while we're
Yeah, man. Getting kind of dry.
We're
I'm
just-
talking too long.
No, sir. No, sir. I appreciate you doing that. You're doing exactly. I know it may seem awkward, but I can't make much noise because they don't want. They want to hear you, not me.
Okay.
So it may seem awkward, but
I'm doing the best I can with what I got to
thank
work
you.
with.
We're gonna. What I'd like to do is, I'm not cutting you off, but just so
Yeah.
you know, we're going to cover about 2 more topics. I want to talk about the tire business, how you got involved in that, and the railroad. So when we
Okay.
get, that's the 2 other topics, and then we'll be winding down. So
All right.
I don't want to.
I got about 6-8 more hours worth of stuff.
Well, you talk as long as you. We don't want to keep you.
I'm
any
no
longer than
hurry.
you're-
I'm no hurry, but I don't want to overdo it.
Sorry,
But
they were just next door, and I was afraid
Thank you,
you'd be able to
precious.
hear them talking
Thank
in
you.
the back,
thank
and
you, beautiful.
Okay, we ready?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm rolling.
Okay.
Are you comfortable? Are you hot?
I'm
Are you
okay. Just right.
Okay. You were talking about your mother. Just to have the full story, tell me about the final years of your mother and when she passed and that. We know about your father, but just for completion.
Well, my mother lived to the early 1970s. I believe she was 81 when she died. She was born in 1892, and it was the year I built the house we live in. I'd always been interested in politics, and I was interested in politics in the school. When I was coming through school, I'd always run for homeroom president, and I was president of the Greer High student body, and I went to Presbyterian College, and I was vice president of the freshman class. But y'all, it's time to stop. Some kind of noise up there. Ain't it? Okay.
You want me to start that question?
All right. Okay.
Jeez. It's one thing, it's
I've
another.
forgotten what you asked me, and I got to crunch.
It's okay. I was asking you about your mother,
Yeah,
but
my-
you led right to what about her final years, which was in
Yeah,
the early
yeah.
70s, and you were leading into your political involvement, which was
Yeah.
perfect.
I
Okay.
turned the air off so it wouldn't come back
All
on.
right, sweet.
If it's on, you let me know. We can stop and I'll
Okay.
turn it back on.
You
Okay?
so
I
nice.
just didn't want it to enter.
Okay.
I
Thanks.
just didn't want it to.
Yeah.
I don't want it to go off while he's talking. There we
I know.
Take that. Thank you.
What you want me to get on there? Get to what you want me to do now?
I would just restart the whole question.
All right.
I-
Start off here.
I was asking you about we know about you talked about your father,
Yeah.
and I was talking about the last years of
Yeah.
your mother,
Well,
so we know.
yeah, my mother was a strong Christian woman. She taught the young men Bible class at the Presbyterian Church, and my 2 brother-in-laws from Chester came over here to work, and they came to her Sunday school class. She brought them home and thought if they didn't marry both of my sisters. So they went to Chester to live and raise families. And my other sister, Nell Dillard, is mother of Steve Dillard, who's still in town, and Elizabeth Clayton, my niece. But my mother was a wonderful, strong Christian lady. She taught the young men's Bible classes, I said. I don't know how many times I've said it, and she was a Bible scholar and teaching the women's circle and active in the church, but she was responsible for 5 of us children. All of them graduated from college but me, and I, after the freshman year, I volunteered for the Army in World War II, and I never did graduate from college, but 2 years ago, Presbyterian College gave me an honorary degree. I said it took me 60 years to get a 4-year degree. And of course, the University of South Carolina gave me an honorary degree in medical university too. So I got a lot of degrees, not to ever done the college work. But anyway, that's who I am. And but my mother, I just can't say it. I think about it every day. It was never doubted her love for her children. She would correct us. And sometimes she'd switch me when I was a boy, and she'd say, "Son, this hurts me worse than it does you." I said, "Why don't you quit then, Mama? Why don't you quit?" But anyway, we every Sunday, there wasn't any question about whether we were going to Sunday school and church or not. We automatically got up and got ready and went to Sunday school and church. And a right interesting thing, when the banks closed, our Presbyterian church owed the bank a mortgage on the church. And so that we weren't incorporated. So the bank thought maybe my people had money and 4 or 5 others in the church. There wasn't any money though, hardly. So the bank put judgments against 6 or 7 members of the church. And my mother was one of them. Of course, we thought that was terrible. But anyway, our church went to the Supreme Court to try to protect our members from picking out members to sue, but we worked out, they did work out a way to pay it off, and it took 5 or 6 years to pay it off, and it was paid off. The church paid it off without individuals having to pay it off, but that was an unusual circumstance that is factual. But I can't say enough good about my mama, I'll tell you. She is a wonderful person, and everybody in this town loved Miss Verne. And she's cooked many a meal for just about anybody. And she put a good meal on the table. If you didn't start bragging on it pretty soon, she'd start bragging on herself.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let's talk about your business, the Tire Exchange.
Okay.
How do you get involved with the tire business?
Sure. Well, when I came home from World War II, I set out. I pulled up about 10 or 12 acres of my daddy's old peach trees, which were 40-something years old, and they needed changing. They had been broken up and all, and so I pulled them up, cleaned up the land, and set out some peach trees. And of course, when you set out young peach trees, where old peach trees have been, a lot of times you have trouble, root disease and different things. But I was farming and growing all kind of things and working hard. Got married, and I just we had a hailstorm and ruined my crop of peaches. I decided I had to get a job with a fixed income. I was going to be married and raising a family, which was a very important decision I made. So I went to work for Mr. Lloyd Hunt at the tire exchange at a very meager salary. But I worked for him for $45 a week for 3 years. And I just couldn't make ends meet because after we'd been married a short time, I guess about 6 months, my wife had become pregnant, and when you started showing back then, you had to resign. You couldn't teach if you were showing. That was the custom. Well, now, you know, they take them from the school to the hospital to have the babies, but the customs were different. So Mama had to resign her job at school. She was making a big $98 a month teaching chemistry and biology at Greer High School with an A certificate from Furman. She graduated from Furman in 3 years. She is so smart, it's scary. And she still thinks I'm one of her pupils sometimes. But anyway, I had to start bringing in some cash money to pay the grocery bill and pay that big $52.20 payment on my house. It was a $8,000 GI loan at 4%. I was thankful for a GI loan. So I had to go to work for Mr. Hunt, and so I worked for him probably about 65 hours a week for $45 a week, and then I drove the tractor at night, and I was working 18 hours a day. I never felt sorry for myself. But the first year I grew peaches, before I went to work for Mr. Hunt, I had a good year. I cleared about $5,500, which was a lot of money back then. I had never made that much working for Mr. Hunt, but I bought an old Army fire truck and built me a bed on it, and I bought peaches from other growers when we got through with my mother's and hauled them to Atlanta, most of them to Atlanta, to sell them, some to Charleston, some to Knoxville, Tennessee. And I had 2 boys that worked with me, and I had 2 trucks. And they took time about going, and I went every trip. And I cleared enough money to buy my furniture and my refrigerator and the stove and bed and so forth when we set up housekeeping and paid a hospital bill when my wife had the baby. And so then I worked for Mr. Hunt, and then he sold me 25% interest in 4 more years. He sold out to me, and one long I was doing as much in a month as we did in a year. And I built a store in Simpsonville and Malden and Greenville, and the Lord's really blessed me in my business. I bought interest in Hercules Tire and Rubber Company in Feeney, Ohio, and that was when it was very small, and it's grown real good. And I was on the board of directors, and I was corporate vice president and on the executive committee and chairman of the finance committee. I had to agree on the amount of credit each other stockholder could have, and I was very much involved in that, and that's how I made my money to pay for my house on the hill.
Right, and that's where let's. I want to ask you one question about
Right.
building. You said buildings. Tell me a little bit about the tire exchange building in Greer.
Okay. Well, Mr. Hunt and Mr. Duncan were partners in what was called a tire exchange, and there was a Esso station right across the street. Later on, Mr. W.E. James and Ennis James ran it. But Daddy built that building to rent to them. And they rented it for $50 a month for quite a while. That, you know, $1 then had no relationship to $1 now. I've worked on many a day for 10 cents an hour when I was a boy. 10 cents an hour. I've worked men in the field, dozens of them, 10 cents an hour, back in the depths of the Depression. When the WPA came along and started paying 25 cents an hour, I didn't see how in the world I was going to be able to pay farm help enough to have anything left, any profit left. People now can't realize how times were then. I just dozens and dozens of times people have knocked on my mother's back door and asked could they do some work for some food. There's been many times, 3 and 4 times, sitting on our back steps eating at Mom, giving them food out the back door. You don't see that, but that's the way it was then. Of course, after the war between the states, we were impoverished here. And then we just started building up, and then we had the Depression of the 30s, and it knocked us back down again. And but Greer kind of got to moving around the 1880s, I think, and my Uncle Tom built, and my Aunt Fanny built a building where the leader was, right down there, where I believe there's a furniture store in a 2-story building, right down in the next block. And
yes, sir.
Uncle Tom had a dry goods store there. My daddy, and I called him Uncle Doug McCorkle, Mr. Renstone had the Greer Furniture store up there. Mr. Davenport had a big business down there on Randall Street. It's that big light-colored brick building. And he sold farmers about everything they needed and sold it to them on the credit and took a mortgage on the crop and charged a pretty good interest and made them a big fortune financing farmers. And he built that beautiful home over there right behind the Presbyterian Church not long before he died. I remember when Mr. Tom Keating was mayor of Greer, and he built a home out there still on North Main Street right next to where the old post office was, right this side. He had a hardware store right along here. And Mr. W.K. Hill was an interesting fella. Ms. Hill, and Ms. Hill had the ladies' store, and Mr. W.K. Hill had the men's store. That was right down there on Trade Street, on the corner of Trade and Randall Street, all the way down there next to where Duke Power used to be. Of course, Smith and James was there. I worked there part-time when I was a boy. I was colorblind, but Lord, I was telling folks that this tie went with that, and I didn't even want to know what I was talking about and anything, but I was the best salesman he ever had.
Very good. Very good. Talking about down the road on Trade Street,
Yeah.
do you anything you recall special about the trains? Because
Yeah.
the railroad was special in this area.
Sure.
Maybe like the P&N? Or?
Oh, yeah. Mr. Buck Duke built the P&N rail, Piedmont and Northern. And Mr. Buck Duke, he's the man that founded Duke Power Company, and he cornered the world tobacco market one time. He lived in Durham, North Carolina. His daddy, and had a brother, Mr. Washington Duke, and they made worlds of money. They bought the patent on cigarette machine, where they could make cigarettes with machines instead of rolling them like you see them rolling them in cowboy movies. I've rolled them anyway when I was a boy, you know, and roll it and lick it. But boy, that cigarette machine, it sold like wildfire. And Mr. Buck Duke made worlds of money, and had one child, Doris Duke, and she died. She was worth hundreds of millions, you know. And Mr. Buck had a brother. That his brother, well, he was a good fellow, but he'd kind of get in a little trouble sometime. He'd make a lot of money, and he'd go to New York, and those showgirls would get that money. I read this out of Tobacco Tycoon, the name of it. And so he went to this dance in Durham, and he danced with this lady there, and oh, she just absolutely hypnotized him. He thought she was the best looking thing he'd ever seen. And so when he was back home, and his chauffeur and butler and servant was helping him to undress, get ready for bed, he said, asked his man, he said, what was that lady's name? He said, man, she's the best looking thing I ever saw. And he said, now, Mr. Duke, don't you start going with that woman. She's been with that every man in Durham. He said, Durham ain't such a big town.
That's right. That's right.
Oh, Lord, that's my mama came from up there around North Carolina in the tobacco country.
Mm-hmm.
And my granddaddy was a tobacco farmer, and her only brother was head of the leaf department with Liggett and Myers Tobacco Company. And he was over all the buyers, and he'd come through here with a chauffeur and chauffeur's cap on. And he was my rich uncle, and we were just working for everything we got. My daddy's brother, my Uncle Ben Smith, he and Mr. Westervelt built Brandon Mill in Greenville and Mill Village, and Uncle Ben made a lot of money, and his only son, John I. Smith, and he was on the board with Liberty Life and other People's Bank, and that fortune grew, and when John I. died, he left what is known as the John I. Smith Charities, and my son's in charge of that, and my niece, my brother was till he died. And they give away about $1 million to $2 million a year to worthwhile causes, and I'm so happy that I could do that.
Okay. I guess one of the...
But I want to get into... I don't have any authority in getting them to give money. I want to get that out. Now, people think I control that, but I don't. Sure.
Sure, yes, sir. You led to some... Well, if you want to take a drink, okay, you're doing fine. You started going down the road of talking about clearly you have an interest in politics.
Yeah, but let me tell you a little more about the railroad.
Oh, yes, sir. Go right ahead.
Well, we graded our peaches and packed them. And so we'd get refrigerated railroad cars and load the peaches in the railroad cars and ship them up north. We shipped peaches to New York, Cincinnati, Washington. And loading those cars was a real art to load them exactly right so they ride right. And I worked all day, many days, and loaded peach cars all night, a lot of times. And we'd ship the peaches up north. Oftentimes, we didn't know what we were going to get for them until we got what we called our returns. Sometimes, they wouldn't sell. And I can remember hearing my daddy talking on the phone with the hang receiver on the side and the hall tree saying, well, you can't get anything for them. And on the phone to the broker up in no, sir. Said, well, give them to the Salvation Army if they want them. If not, dump them in the Potomac River. And sometimes we'd ship fruit up there and we didn't even get freight on. Now that's depression. That's not recession. That's depression.
Yes, sir.
But our main dealing with the railroads was shipping peaches. But Greer, when they were talking about bringing the railroad from Charleston up through here to Greenville, they were routing it through Reedville, South Carolina. And the town fathers at Reedville said, we don't want that thing coming through here. It'll scare our livestock to death and all. And the folks here in Greer said, we want to come through Greer. And that's the reason we are developed with the cotton mills we had and the industry we had. And we grew and had paying jobs and all, and they just had farms. And they did have a nice school that Dr. Reed and them had, a Reedville Academy, that one for the girls and one for the boys, and it was they lived there, and it was a great school. Wade Hampton made a speech there in 1870s when he was running for governor.
Huh. I didn't know that. Okay. Tell me, we're winding up here, but tell me a little more about you personally. You said you started talking earlier about your interest in politics ever since you were young.
Yeah.
Go through that
well,
history with me.
I liked history, and I like to read about stories about people representing their people in government. And so, as I said, I took an interest in politics, in school politics, and then later in city politics. I ran for Commissioner of Public Works, and I was chairman of it when we built Lake Cunningham and Lake Robinson and expanded the electrical system and the sewer system. And I like to work out things that serve the public interest, and so I always supported a candidate for governor, and I enjoyed doing that, and I was kind of the campaign manager for several governors. So later, I became Democratic chairman for Greenville County, and so I'd seek candidates to run, and got to say, well, why don't you run? And a lot of people said, well, Verne, I'm on the other side. The Republican Party started coming along. That started in the 60s over integration. And I'm a Republican now, but it was the rebirth of the Republican Party was definitely racial, not Rachel, but racial. It was segregation fed the growth of the Republican Party. I stayed out of it a long time because of that. I was chairman of the committee for racial harmony, and Dr. Harold at Furman said we integrated the schools with grace and style, but I was one of those guys that wanted peace and not what some of them talking about, carrying axe handles and things. I met the bus, some of them down at East Greer. I met the bus when they first brought the load of integrated students, because myself, when they said that some Rystabats were going to be there and run them back, but they didn't show up. But I was there in case they did. But I get to talking about all those things, and I forget what you want me to talk about.
You were talking about your political
yeah,
involvement
so
as chairman.
I decided I wanted to run for the General Assembly. And we were living in that little house on Miller Street. And Gene said, Daddy, you don't keep on building tire stores and warehouses, and you're going to go off to Columbia in politics, and I'm going to be feeding company off a card table the rest of my life. So she kind of gave me a proposition I couldn't refuse. So we, you know how women do, fellas, sometimes.
Yes, yes, sir.
Well, we got an architect, and I bought the top of that hill where we lived from my mother. That was part of my mother and my daddy's farm, and we built that house, and after I built the house, she said, now I'll help you run And I said, well, I'm going to run for the Senate. If I'm going to run, I'm going to run for a 4-year term, not 2 years. So I had to run against a fellow that had been a United States senator, and he was in the South Carolina Senate. And I got to working so hard, for some reason he dropped out. Then they put another fellow in there, but I outworked him and I won. And I've run 8 times, and I don't believe I've had opposition but twice. I've tried it both ways, with opposition, without, and I like it a lot better without opposition.
Well, thank you for saying that. And clearly...
and I'm running for re-election as a Republican and proud of it.
Yes, sir. We know that. Thank you. Well, we're winding up. Is there anything you'd like to add, or maybe give your thoughts of where you'd like to see Greer in the future?
Well, I really love Greer and the people of Greer. When I went off to the Army, I was thinking that Greer is not a big enough place for me. I got to have a bigger, better place to make my fortune. More of this world I saw, more I realized if the good Lord let me get back to Greer, I'd be so happy to stay there with the people and live my life in Greer, and I've never regretted it. It's the best little town in South Carolina and the best people in the world.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. We're done.